I'm going to talk about Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants. One of the things you might have noticed in this story is from 1927, that clearly Hemingway's work is very influential for Raymond Carver's work as well, right? That what we talk about when we talk about love is told primarily through dialogue, and here very clearly almost the entirety of this is dialogue. And you have to read very carefully because it doesn't even include speaker tags all the time, right? So we don't always identify the speaker, but if you read slowly and carefully, you can determine who is having what part of the conversation. We have two characters primarily, although we have the waitress who comes out. And in the dialogue, we learn everything. We learn, for example, that this young woman is not from Spain, right? We are sitting somewhere out in the Spanish countryside between Barcelona and Madrid. We're waiting for the train. This young woman doesn't speak Spanish, right? So that the waitress asks something, and it's very clear that the American, the man, has to translate for her. So we know she's not Spanish. We know that their relationship, for example, is fairly differential in terms of power in the relationship, right? He's the man or the American, right, identified in those ways, and she is the girl or Jig, right? So not necessarily that she is actually a literal girl. It's this sort of suggestion that she is viewed as less than an adult somehow, right? And Jig's not a name, Jig's a nickname, right? I mean, not that he has a name either, but that this suggestion that somehow he has the upper hand in this relationship, or seems to think that he does. So in this conversation, right, what we want to think about is when the story starts, right, how long is it going to be until the train comes, and how long is it before the train comes at the end? It turns out it's actually a fairly long time for a very short story. So if we think about how long they're sitting there, about 35 minutes or so, having only this conversation, right, that really adds to this sort of suggestion of this is an awkward experience. There are tons of silences. Right? And what do people do in silences? What do people do when there's an awkwardness? Quite frequently it's eating a meal, but here it's sitting in a bar in a train station drinking. Right? That we're having, these beers, probably not huge beers. They don't have that much time, but drinking glasses of beer and trying the Anis del Toro, which is a specialty of the region, right? It's a specialty liqueur. And what we want to pay attention to, right? So anytime we actually get any description of setting, we want to pay attention to that. Of course, because this is a railroad, this is not a crossroads, but they're trying to make a decision. And of course, right, as it gradually kind of comes out, right, it becomes clear that what they're talking about is that she is pregnant and that he thinks she should have an abortion because things will change, right? And they do change irrevocably either way, right? That is particularly if she decides to have a child, their lives will be very, very different. And he knows, right? He says it's really an awfully simple operation. It's not really an operation at all, right? This idea of this medical intervention, let's make you do, you should do this. It's really very simple. And his concern, right, is, well, it'll be like it always was then. We know they've been traveling around Europe. And now this time period, 1920s, Americans spent a lot of time in Europe. It was a very inexpensive place for Americans to be and for Americans to travel, particularly the former GIs from World War I. And Hemingway was an expatriate. He spent a lot of time in Europe during this time period. So we know quite potentially this is even almost semi-autobiographical. As you think about this, right, so we know that they're arguing over this, but it's this tense, long argument. But pay attention to what the symbols of both the setting and the things that they say, particularly this idea of white elephants. But we can think about, when we think about the setting here, right, we have these long white hills, right? There's this sort of barren side on one side, and on another side, it's described as sort of this beautiful, sort of lush valley, right? On the other side were fields of grain and trees along the banks of the Ebro, right? So you have this beautiful, lush side and this really looking very barren side, right? And so that even that in and of itself, it becomes symbolic. But again, they're on a train station. They're midway between two major cities where there'd be major train stations. This is just somewhere where the train stops for a few minutes and you get on. You can go one way or you can go the other. You cannot double back. So all of these pieces add into that sort of theme, using the setting as a way to talk about the theme. We can also think about how this man treats this woman that he is in this relationship with, right? This idea of how does he view her? How does he see her? And how does she see him in the end? And so we want to think about, kind of what is the story as it turns out? How does this wind up being about a relationship and where it is at this particular stage?